Chomsky is the principal architect of generative linguistics and has been the driving force in recent evolutions of the theory, including in the development of the principles and parameters framework, which one commentator has described as, quote, the first really novel approach to language in the last 2,500 years. Professor Chomsky has also been a key figure in the development of the cognitive sciences generally, indeed the most important figure in their development according to Harvard's Howard Gardner. He is perhaps most famous for his writings and lectures on international politics and in media theory. It is less well known, however, that Professor Chomsky has been an important figure in Anglo-American philosophy over the last 50 years, and that he has been a key interlocutor with all the leading philosophers of language and mind within that tradition. He's had lively exchanges with, for example, Willard Van Orman Quine, Hilary Putnam, Donald Davidson, Saul Kripke, John Searle, Michael Dummett, and now a new generation of philosophers. And I guess the first question has to be the following. Given everything that's on your plate, why do you bother with the philosophers?
Well, that's the most fascinating topic of all. It's what I grew up with and still am obsessed with.
Why do you think other linguists are not, or in general other scientists don't seem to be as engaged with the philosophical community?
Well, scientists tend, I think, to be involved in their own technical problems and often don't think much about, what it's about. So, I for many years taught courses in these questions and would have students read, say, Quine's papers in which he argues that everything they're doing is complete, what he called folly, and he gives arguments saying you can't possibly do it this way. The students will read the papers, but then go back to doing, and say, kind of interesting, and then go back to doing exactly the same work that they've just read is folly and can't be done, and so on and so forth. And I think that's not unusual. If you read the scientific literature, there's a lot of expressed contempt for what philosophers have to say about this. So you'll read somebody working on the neurophysiology of consciousness, big hot topic, and there'll be an obligatory first couple of paragraphs saying, well, the philosophers have muddled this up for centuries, but now we'll show how it's done, but with no engagement in the arguments that have been given or the thinking behind it.
Does it trouble you that, say, most other linguists don't engage philosophers on these issues?
It troubles me, because not so much that, it's connected to a deeper problem. I think it should trouble us that we're not thinking about what we're up to. And those questions happen to be the domain of what philosophers pay attention to.
Right. Let's turn to some of these philosophers and some of the things that they've said. The first one I want to look at is the Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam. In the mid-'70s, he wrote a paper called The Meaning of Meaning, which is very influential. And I guess the key slogan that came out of that is that meanings just ain't in the head. Agree, disagree, or is that just incoherent?
It's incoherent without further explanation. First you have to tell us what meanings are. You can't decide whether they're in the head or not until we know what they are. If by meanings we have in mind what people have in mind when they're using the word in English, then sure, they're not in the head. They're all over the place. Talk about the meaning of life, it's not in the head. If you have some more technical notion in mind, you've got to explain what it is. If the technical, and there it's a matter of choice. You can define the technical notion so that it's in the head or so that it's not in the head. When you define technical notions, you have a choice. The way it's done in the sciences, and the way it ought to be done, is you define a technical notion in the context of an explanatory theory. You don't just define a technical notion out in space. So let's ask, what's the explanatory theory in which we're going to give a technical notion which will pronounce meaning or pronounce it some other way, and then we'll ask whether that theory is a sensible theory and does it place this technical concept in the head or not. But all that extra work hasn't been done.
Why can't we say there's just a pre-theoretical notion of meaning, and what we want to do is try and elucidate or precisify it in some way or other?
Yeah, you could do that, but there's a million ways of doing it. So what about the meaning of life, for example? That's part of the pre-theoretical notion.
Is it?
Is it? Sure it is. I mean, I thought people talk about the meaning of what's the meaning of life all the
Yeah, and
time.
you think that's the same notion of meaning as when you say what's the meaning of the word?
No, there's thousand. You know, it's a huge range of things. What did he mean by saying so and so? Usually has to do with what was his intention, you know, or something like that.
Right.
So part of the pre-theoretical meaning has to do with people's intentions. In fact, when you talk about the meaning of a word, that's a rather English-specific locution, and we could focus on that if we like. But and if you want, you can try to clarify it. But again, to try to clarify a pre-theoretical notion makes sense within the framework of an effort to understand something, to an explanatory account.
Well, suppose we go with the following attempt to clarify, or at least introduction of a piece of technical terminology, which is philosophers will talk about the content of a mental state, or the content of some sort of expression. Is that helpful?
No, because content is a technical notion. It's not being used in the sense of the ordinary concept content.
Right.
And used by now, since Putnam, in fact, and Kripke and others, it's typically used to refer to something out there. So the content of an expression is not in the head by definition, because we've defined it to be not in the head.
Right.
All right, then the question is, well, does that have anything to do with our notions of, does that have anything to do with our understanding of the way language works and is used? Okay, that's the question.
And
you can certainly, I think it has very little to do with it.
well, suppose we thought of it this way. Suppose we thought of the enterprise being sketched in the following way. There are two ways in which you might study primates, for example. You might study primate anatomy, in which case you're just concerned about, you know, bones and muscles and tendons and so forth. And then you might also study primate ecology, in which case you're studying the relation between the primate and its environment. And I take it that what these philosophers are talking about here, when they talk about external content, is that they're saying a part of talk about meaning has to be analyzed in terms of thinking about the organism, the human organism, in relation to its environment, right? So
it has to, if you want to study the relation between the human organism and its environment. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with studying the human organism and its environment. That's what sociologists are doing all the time.
Right.
But you have to do it seriously. If you want to do it seriously, you ask, first of all, let's go back to primates. When you study primates in their ecology, you don't just look at the anatomy of primates. You look at the physiology of primates, what you might call mental processes of primates, I mean, the way they seem to be interpreting the world, the perceptual abilities of primates. In fact, what you try to do is exploit, to the extent you can, what we know about an individual ape. You know, a chimpanzee, say, you want to know, what do we understand about that ape? And that information we will bring to bear in the study of how the ape interacts with other apes and with the rest of the environment and so on. That's the way it's done with primates or with ants or anyone else, and I think that's the way it ought to be done with humans. So we should ask, okay, well, what do we understand about the internal nature of the creature that's doing all these things? And to the extent that we understand something about that, we can ask sensible questions about how it interacts with the external world, with other people, and so on and so forth.
do you think that could potentially inform the sort of internalist investigation as well?
Sure, it goes the other way. I mean, there's no order. You can study the sociology of ape communities, and that'll tell you something, could tell you something important about the internal thinking processes of apes, or even their internal anatomy.
And vice versa, presumably.
Yeah, sure. Science goes all ways.
Here's another technical term that's been used, reference. You consider that to be incoherent as well? Or?
Well, until it's explained, it's incoherent. Once it's explained, then it becomes non-incoherent.
Well, you see, one thing I've never quite understood is exactly what the problem is with reference, because, I mean, I can say, well, okay, now I'm referring to this coffee cup.
That's different. That's quite different.
Okay.
You're talking about an action of referring.
Right.
That's a common sense notion. It's part of English and every language I know of. There's some way to talk about such actions. But what philosophers have introduced is a different notion, a notion that's supposed to hold between a linguistic entity and something in the world. Now, that's not referring. Referring is an act that people do. Peter
this is the point that goes
pointed
back
this
to
out
Strawson,
50
right?
years
Yeah.
ago, but I mean, it goes way back. But
Well,
and it's just a fact.
Okay, so let's
now,
take this.
If you want to make up a technical term which you pronounce the same way,
Yeah.
first of all, it's questionable whether you should pronounce it the same way because it's misleading. But if you do, let's at least keep clear that it's a technical term, kind of like physicists use energy. You know, they don't mean it the way we do in ordinary language. They mean it the way they say they mean it. So let's take the technical term, refer or denote or whatever you want to call it, and tell us what it's supposed to, tell us what you mean by it, and tell us what explanatory theory it enters into. So when a physicist defines energy, you're not interested in the definition. You're interested in the set of principles and assumptions and so on, problems and so on, within which that technical concept is introduced. And then you look and see how good the theory is. Well, here we don't have any theory. And we don't even have an explanation of what the technical notion is. So it's impossible to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it might be a mistake to think of it as a technical notion. I mean, I think it's just a sort of precisified way of describing certain basic core-level facts, right?
Right.
So, for example, I might say, well, once you understand that people refer to things and so forth, it's not a hard step to say, well, okay, certain names are canonically used to refer to certain things and certain individuals. So the name Noam Chomsky, I mean, I can ask the audience here, what person in this room does that term refer to?
Well,
and
you could ask, what do you use that term when you refer to something in the world? That you can ask. Right. But when you ask what the term refers to, you're assuming that there is a relation between terms and things. And then you have to explain what that relation is, because that's a new one. We don't have that in ordinary language. And in fact, I think it's leading us off into a wrong picture, as Wittgenstein would have called it. And it's leading us to a picture of language, which is, we know what it's based on. I mean, it's based on things like Frege's, the theory of arithmetic. And it's just the wrong picture for language, I think.
I want to change directions briefly. We may actually end up being sucked back into this issue. Donald Davidson, in a paper called A Nice Derangement of Epitaphs, said, or basically argued that there's no such thing as language. And I've always sort of thought that you may not want to admit it, but on some level or other, you probably agree with that, right?
No. In fact, I think he ended up contradicting himself. I think there's some discussion of it in here or somewhere. If you look at the end of the paper, it turns out he's presupposing that there is a notion of language in the technical sense of an internal generative procedure that relates sounds and meanings and so on. He says there's no notion of language in another sense, the sense of some community property or whatever. Well, okay, first of all, I don't even think that's true. It's not a scientifically usable sense. But I think the paper is just rife with confusions. I've written about it.
So you think there are such things as languages?
Yeah, like there's such
in
things.
In an informal sense.
Like there's such things as the meaning of life. And I understand it when people ask, what's the meaning of life? So yeah, there's such a thing as the meaning of life. There's such a thing as the financial crisis in Argentina. There are all kind of things in the world. But if you want to proceed to understand what you and I are doing, those notions just don't help. You've got to look at it differently, the way we look at primates, other primates, in fact.
Well, let me read a quote from something you wrote recently, okay? You say, I doubt that people think that among the constituents of the world are entities that are simultaneously abstract and concrete, like books and banks, or that have the amalgam of properties we discover when we explore the meanings of even the simplest words, like river, person, city, etc. Yeah. You think the average person doesn't believe in the cities?
That's a technical question.
Okay.
It's a question if you try to figure out what a person's folk science is, how people think the world is actually constituted of entities, which is not, do I talk about books? Of course we talk about books. We talk about the meaning of life and so on.
Right.
But if you ask people, well, how do you think the world really works? That's the problem with ethnoscience.
Right.
It's like you go to some other community and you try to figure out what's their idea about how the world works. Like maybe the classical Greeks thought Apollo pulls the sun through the sky or something. That's their folk scientific picture of how the world works.
Right.
That's a hard topic. You can't just do armchair philosophy about it. That's why ethnoscientists have to work. And when they work, what they find, I think if they worked on people like us, instead of just talking about it in a, in the common room, they would discover that our folk science, yours and mine, does not include entities that are simultaneously abstract and concrete, and does not include entities like the meaning of life. That doesn't mean we can't talk about them. Sure, we talk about them all the time, but we don't, at least I don't, and I presume other people don't, think of them as constituents of the way the world operates. We don't do that when we're talking to each other informally.
Now, that sounds a little bit more moderate than what you've said elsewhere. Here's a passage from, I believe this is from New Horizons, where you say, in the domain where questions of realism arise in a serious way, in the context of the search for laws of nature, objects are not conceived from the peculiar perspectives provided by the concepts of common sense.
That's absolutely right. See, but there's several different enterprises that you have to distinguish here, and I don't think it's more or less moderate. It's about a different topic. When you're trying to understand something about the nature of the world, you and I, anybody, you start with some kind of what's called folk science. Almost every society we know has some picture of the way the world works, which is more or less commonly shared. If you try to do this more reflectively and carefully, and bringing in other criteria, and probably bringing in other cognitive faculties, we don't know that for sure, right, but I suspect it, then it becomes the enterprise of science, which is a different enterprise, and a peculiar one. It's not folk science, it's science. That works in other ways. This comment has to do with our culture, in which the enterprise of science is understood,
right,
our intellectual culture, and in that, when we try to find out how the world works, we discard the concepts of common sense very quickly.
But it sounds to me here like what you're saying is that the only things that are real, right, are the things that science tells us are real. So it sounds like what you're saying here is that, well, this table isn't real, but maybe, quarks.
Real is an honorific term.
Okay.
You can use it any way you like. I mean, to say, if I say something is true and then I add, well, it's the real truth, I'm not saying there are two different kinds of truth, the truth and the real truth. I'm just emphasizing what I said. And the term real is basically used honorifically. So yeah, you can use it honorifically in various ways. If we're trying to find out the way the world works and to really understand it in the manner of the sciences, we very quickly give up common sense notions. If we're carrying out folk science, less reflectively, probably using different cognitive faculties, we also give up common sense notions, but in different ways.
Well, you can say a lot of, claims about something being honorific, like real being honorific. Alan Gibbard, for example, has argued that terms like rational are honorific, or moral are honorific.
Well, I don't agree with that. Okay. I think real is quite different.
But what's the difference in these cases, then?
Because I think rationality is something that we can understand, and morality is something real, and it's part of us, and we can try to figure out what it is. We can try to figure out what our moral faculties are. We understand something about what rational action is. But about reality, we have to ask what we're talking about.
Right.
If we're talking about reality in the enterprise of trying to discover the way the world works in a physics department or a linguistics department or whatever, common sense notions are irrelevant. If we're trying to explore our intuitive understanding of the way the world works, common sense notions are relevant, but we discard them. If you're using it in a more informal way, like is the meaning of life real? Yeah, sure, okay.
Well, look, there's a sort of space between ethnoscience and science, right, and common sense and all of those. And it's been explored by philosophers for 2,500 years, and it's called metaphysics, right?
No, that's different.
Okay,
see,
that is a question about what's real, right?
Ethnoscience is a branch of science.
Right.
Ethnoscience is the branch of science that tries to figure out what people's beliefs are about the way the world works.
Right.
Metaphysics is not that.
I understand that, but
Okay.
do you think that metaphysics is impossible?
No, science is metaphysics.
Oh, okay, good.
It's talking about what the world is made of.
All right. So, but then the question is, why do you think that science gets to claim what's real? Now, let me give you an example. So, in the scientific image, Bas van Fraassen is a scientific anti-realist. So he says the things posited by science, quarks, etc., are not real, but mid-sized earthbound objects are real. Now, you've got the flip side of that, right?
I don't have any side because I don't think the word real is sensible enough to use. I mean, they're all real in different senses. If you're trying to understand the way the world actually works, whether you're Bas van Fraassen or you or me, we're going to go to the scientists because they tell us how the world really works. If we're interested in exploring people's common sense beliefs, we'll go to the ethnoscientists and see what they discover.
What if we're interested in something like whether there are events or whether there are properties or whether there are mereological sums or something?
Well, let's take events, which plays a prominent role in modern semantics.
Right.
So here you can ask a lot of different questions. For one thing, you can ask whether in, say, Davidsonian semantics, where there's a lot of, or anything that developed from it, event-based semantics, whether the things, whether what are called events are internal to the mind or outside the head.
Right.
But I think they're internal to the mind.
Can't they be both?
Well, they could, but then we're asking another question.
Right.
If we're asking, well, how do these things that are internal to the mind relate to something in the outside world, we'll say, okay, let's take a look at what you mean by an event. So, for example, is the American Revolution an event? Yeah, it was an important event in history. Does that event include the fact that the man who the indigenous population called the town destroyer took off a little time in the middle of the revolution to destroy the Iroquois civilization? Is that part of the event called the American Revolution? Well, not when you study it in school, you know. You want to find out about that event, you got to probably the Iroquois, remember, but the ones who are left, or you've got to look at serious scholarly history. Then you find out that one part of what was going on in the event that we call the American Revolution was a side operation in 1979 to wipe out the Iroquois civilization so that the colonies could expand if they got rid of the British. Well, is that part of the event or isn't it? Well, you know, here come hard questions about what we're really going to call events in the outside world. And those questions don't have answers because they are, you know, they're highly dependent on our interests, our perspective, our goals, you know, all kinds of factors. So I don't think we're going to find external events in any sense worth pursuing for investigation of what the world is like.
Why can't these external events just be complicated objects?
It can be anything you like, but is the town destroyer's exploit part of the American Revolution, or isn't it?
Well,
that event.
It
well,
sounds,
you know, it's your choice. But there's no answer to that.
Yeah, but now it sounds like you're saying that, well, I have representations of events, right? The representations
no, I have representations.
You have representations.
I have representations, some which we informally call events.
Right, but now one might ask, what on earth is a representation if it's not a representation of something?
Well, see, that's a mistake that comes from a philosophical tradition. The way the term represent is used in the philosophical tradition, it's a relation between an internal object and an external object.
Exactly.
It's not the way it's used either in ordinary speech or in the sciences. So when a perceptual psychologist, say, talks about an internal representation of, you know, a cube or something, there doesn't have to be any cube there. They're talking about something that's going on in the head. In fact, what they may be studying, and usually are studying, is a relation between things like tachistoscopic presentations and internal events. There's no cube, but nevertheless, they talk about it as an internal representation. I mean, the concept internal, there's a long discussion of that in here. The concept internal representation is used in the sciences, and I think that's ordinary speech too, in ways which don't involve a relation between an internal thing and an external thing. Right. I mean, that derives from a particular interpretation of the theory of ideas, you know, which said, well, ideas represent something out there.
I should interject here.
Incidentally, I should say that that's not the interpretation of the theory of ideas that were given by the people who used it. So, like, say, Hume, for example. I quote him in there. What he raises a serious empirical question. He says it's about the nature of the terms he uses, the identity that we ascribe to things, meaning how do we individuate things?
Right.
And he asks the question, well, is this a peculiar nature common to the thing, or is it what he calls fictitious, a construction of the mind?
Right.
And he says fictitious. There is no entity, there is no common nature, there is no nature common to the thing. There is a construction of the mind, which we used to talk about the world.
But he's an idealist.
I mean, no, he's not an idealist.
Hume's not an idealist?
No, not here. He's saying We interact. He believes there's an external world out there. There's a coffee cup on the table and so on. But he says that he's talking about the individuation of things, how we organize things, how we construct our picture of the world.
Right.
And that involves the way our minds work. And that doesn't mean the world isn't there. No, it's just what his predecessors called our cognoscitive powers, which use the data of sense to construct an account of the world. And he's saying, well, you want to look at the identity of things, the identity that we ascribe to things, like what makes us call something a book or an event and so on. He's saying, well, it's fictitious in the sense that it's a construction of the mind based on the data of sense. That's not an idealist position. In fact, that's the position of modern science.
Because people will call you a crypto-idealist.
Well, then they're misunderstanding what idealism was.
Okay. Let me, there's an issue that I wanted to get to here, and this involves the thing we mentioned about representations and whether a representation requires there being something that it is a representation of. Now, in a very important and somewhat influential book by Saul Kripke, there's a revival of the sort of Wittgensteinian argument about rule following. Let me just read the relevant passage here. So in that book, Kripke says, if statements attributing rule following are neither to be regarded as stating facts nor to be thought of explaining our behavior, it would seem that the use of the idea of rules and competence in linguistics needs serious reconsideration, even if these notions are not rendered meaningless. Now, I know I've written on that in Knowledge of Language.
The crucial word is if.
Right.
Okay, and the fact is that in the sense in which the term rule is used for thousands of years, in fact, in the study of language, it's not the kind of rule he had in mind. So if you read a book, you study Latin, let's say, or you studied it 1,000 years ago, they would have a rule that tells you, when to use the ablative case or something.
Right.
That's not a rule in Wittgenstein's sense. It's a description of a part of the language.
Right.
So the questions about rule following just don't arise. But
we don't need to get hung up on rules and so forth.
But that's what he's talking about.
I understand that, but in a certain sense he's talking about any sort of computational state. But so take just a computer, right? Forget about human beings for a second.
See, computers are a different story.
Okay.
Let's take an insect.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
See, why aren't these questions asked about insects?
Right.
I mean, insects, when you study insects, you attribute to them computational states.
Right.
Is that a problem? I mean, is it not real? Like if you say that an insect is doing, is determining the position of the sun as a function of the time of year and time of day, and here's the computation it's using, why isn't that science?
That would be, but the argument would be that the reason you can get away with that is because you're talking about what the representations that you're attributing to the insect are externalistically anchored. That is, you couldn't do it unless you had an embedded system.
That's not true. You could do it in an experimental situation in which you have a light, and in fact, if you knew how to do it, you could do it by stimulating the external sensory organs of the insect. It would all be interior. And there doesn't have to be a sun there. No, it's just that, you're talking about it the way it happens actually in the real world, but the same thing, you would say the same thing in an experimental setting where you don't have an external world. Well, because you're talking about the internal construct computations of the insect on the occasion of sense. Doesn't matter what's out there. Notice
the shift there, though, because you went from saying you don't need the sun in the experimental setting to saying you don't. You could run the experiment in a world that didn't have the sun, and that's a different story, right?
No, it's not a different story. The point is, if you look at what insect scientists are studying, they're studying what 17th century philosophers used to call the constructions of the mind on the occasion of sense.
Right.
Now, it happens that in the world that they're looking at, the occasions of sense happen to be related to the fact that there's something 93 million miles away.
Right.
But the study could go on as if it's what Hillary called a brain in a vat. The studies are internalist because we don't know anything else to study.
But this is disputed, right? I mean, there is this dispute about David Marr, right? I mean, there's two stories on this. Tyler Burge and Martin Davis, for example, argue that Marr is sort of fraught with externalist sort of.
Yeah, but they're just misreading him.
Okay.
I mean, in fact, I have to know Marr personally, but I mean, I'm sure if he was here, he would say this. If you look at the informal exposition in Marr's vision, let's say, book vision, you look at the informal exposition, in order to motivate what he's doing, he says, well, imagine, an elephant or anything like a stick figure, and you're trying to, we want to know how that thing out there is interpreted by the visual system as some three-dimensional object.
Right.
However, if you look at the experimental procedures of MAR, they didn't have elephants out there. In fact, what they were using was tachistoscopes, so they were having dots on screens, and if they had known how to stimulate the optic nerve, they would have done that. When you go from the informal exposition to the actual science, you see that, like everything else, it's a study of the internal nature of the beast. And in fact, they would have loved to get to the point where they could tell you something about how you identify an elephant, but they never got anywhere near that. However, even if they did, it wouldn't matter whether the elephant is there or not. It wouldn't matter what sensory, what's the occasion of sense. Again, the 17th century formulation of this was, I think, quite appropriate. On the occasion of sense, the cognoscitive, it sounds archaic, but the cognoscitive powers of the mind construct complicated internal structures which have all sorts of properties, and Gestalt properties, what Hume later called the identity that we ascribe to things and so on, and that looks correct. And that's the way modern science looks at it. The fact that the informal expositions, to sort of motivate what you're doing, talk about identifying objects in the outside, that's fine, but you have to know how to distinguish informal expositions from the actual scientific program. And if you look at the actual program, they never looked at things outside, aside from tachistoscopic images, because they're as close as you can get to the occasion of sense.
It's about time to move on to our very eager studio audience here, so let's turn to them.
Hi, how are you? You mentioned event semantics and how that's sort of been pulled into, or is a part of some linguistic research, and I'd like to ask a question about that and just hear more about it. The way Piotrowski uses it in the article in the book that's sitting on your table, he'll take a sentence.
We've been referring to this book, and
Yeah.
I should point out it's called Chomsky and His Critics, which just came out from Blackwell's.
Right. And the article is by Paul Piotrowski, I think. And so he'll take the sentence, John boiled the water, and I'm going to ignore the sort of the larger context, but and then turn that into something that's something like there was an event of which John was the agent, and it was concerning a boiling, and the theme was water, or it terminated in a boiling, excuse me, and the theme was water, something like that, right? And then Piotrowski tries to fit that together with a syntactic account of how that how that formal representation can turn into the sentence that you hear. So you recognize in your reply that it's an open question whether that is the subject matter of this whole analysis is in the language faculty or in the cognitive. It's something cognitive, system going on.
It's all internal, though.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
Let's
all
assuming
syntax.
that
it's all syntax in the sense that it's involved with internal computations.
Right. Fine. So the question then is and you say it's an empirical question whether it's in the language faculty or in the cognitive system. So first of all, what would be some ways to determine empirically what that is, and also what would it even mean for it to be? I have a trouble understanding what it would mean for it to be in the language faculty, because then it seems like our language faculty has certain event metaphysics built into it.
Well, not event metaphysics. Okay. It's well, first of all, there's no event metaphysics in the ordinary sense of event. Events are things out there.
Okay.
And all of this is formal manipulations inside. And we're now asking the question, what is the architecture of the mind? Which is like asking, what's the structure of some benzene molecule? You want to know the structure of the benzene molecule, you can't just think about it. You have to have some theory that tells you how you look at such questions. Well, the study of I think there are real answers to the question what the architecture of the mind is, but they're not going to be easy to find. You want to find out what the language faculty is? Well, you're going to when you talk about any subsystem of an organism, say the circulatory system or the immune system or the digestive system or whatever it may be, you're kind of presupposing that it makes sense to look at a complex organism as if it has components each component having kind of an integrated character with its own properties that's worth studying in itself. But it's not separable, like you can't cut the immune system out of the body. But you're saying there's things, it's in every cell, you know. But you're saying, look, it has properties you can study by themselves, you can learn things about them. When you put the whole picture together, you hope you'll understand something about the organism. Well, same when you're studying the cognitive architecture. We want to see, is there a component, call it the language faculty, we don't know what it is, you have to discover it and refine it and change it. Is there a component which is critically involved in what you and I are doing in some fashion, which has its own intrinsic properties? So is it going to turn out, say, that it has particular interface conditions and some kind of internal recursive computational process? Well, if it does, then we can, the more we understand about that and how it fits into the general cognitive architecture, the clearer these questions become about whether something's inside it or outside it. And those are very concrete questions. I mean, take, say, anaphora, you know, what are called referential relations of intended referential dependency. Okay, are they inside the language faculty or outside? Well, that's a substantive issue. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said inside. Now I think there's evidence that they're outside, right on the edge. And the reason for that has to do with beliefs about how the language faculty works. So if the language faculty does involve optimal computation that requires cyclic derivations, and if anaphora looks at global properties, you know, condition C of the binding theory, well, it's outside. But that's a question that you can't ask in advance. You have to ask, well, what does it look like? What does it seem these faculties are like? You know, the more you learn about them, the more you can, formulate these questions clearly. And that's the kind of question that comes up about the internal notion of event. Is it in the language faculty, the semantic component of the language faculty, or is it in some other faculty that's linked to it? And you can't, you just can't speculate about that. You have to learn about it.
And I guess that's my question. I just from ignorance have a hard time picturing what kind of empirical evidence would count in adjudicating between those.
If I'd known it, I would have said.
Okay.
I mean, I think these are the kind of questions, like, what is the empirical evidence that bears on whether anaphora is on one or the other side of the border of the language faculty? Well, the empirical evidence, in my mind at least, turns on whether, in fact, there's a single cyclic derivational process that goes, by what I call phases, stepwise. That's an empirical question, but, all kinds of things bear on it, coming from everywhere. Once that empirical question is sharpened, you can ask whether a global property of anaphora is inside or outside.
Thank you.
Actually, similar questions, I might say, arise on the phonetic side. So take, say, prosody. Prosody appears to have global properties. Okay, so is it inside or outside the cyclic derivation, which is forming bigger and bigger units? Well, if the properties really are global, it's outside. But you can't answer that, and the kind of evidence that bears on that comes from everywhere. It might come from chemistry, for all we know, when we try to figure out how these processes work.
You've made it clear that science plays a primary role in philosophy, and I was curious to know what role, if any, does philosophy play in science?
Well, here I think it helps to look at the question in a little more historical depth. If you had asked Hume, are you a scientist or a philosopher, he couldn't answer, because there was no distinction. If you'd asked Kant, are you a philosopher or a scientist, he couldn't have answered. In fact, until the latter part of around the middle of the 19th century, there was no really clear distinction between science and philosophy. I mean, if you study science in Oxford and Cambridge, it's the Department of Natural Philosophy or Moral Philosophy, because philosophy was just, science was just one part of philosophy. It weren't distinct. By the latter part of the 19th century, they sort of became separated. And after that, it's really a matter of choice. Disciplines don't exist. We construct them. So, deans have to have ways of organizing departments because it's too much trouble to have everybody do everything. But there's no boundary to what's in chemistry. and there's no boundary to what's in philosophy. It just depends what philosophers want. People call themselves, who come out of this tradition and want to study. And a lot of what they want to study is questions in the foundations of science, or say the kind of things that Bas van Fraassen is trying to clear up using the results of science. These are all fine questions, and people tend to call them philosophy. You could call them, parts of them at least, you could call thoughtful science, or reflective moral theory, or you call them anything you want. But there's a range of questions which have come to be in the domain of philosophy, and they can extend all over the place. I mean, there are people in philosophy departments who are working on the foundation of quantum theory and making contributions to it.
Hello. I'd like to go back to insect navigation once more. And I take it that we explore insect navigation because we want to find out how insects navigate in their natural environment. And you're right to point out that in an experiment we can replace the sun by an artificial light and so on. But I mean, it seems like we still, in the whole explanatory context, we cannot just do without the sun and the actual objects in the real world, because otherwise, I mean, an explanation of insect navigation becomes meaningless. And so it seems to me that we have to have the assumption that insects represent the actual sun and not just dots of light.
No, we don't have to have that. In fact, the way science works, of course, you're interested in the outside world, but if you're taking a physics course here, they don't use videotapes of what's happening outside the window, because it's just useless. It doesn't let you figure out how the world is working. So you disregard that. Beyond the earliest stages of science, I mean, at the earliest stages, yeah, you see apples falling from trees and that kind of thing. But as soon as you get anywhere, you start designing artificial situations called experiments, in which you try to refine the evidence so that it will shed light on principles which you believe will ultimately bear on what's going on outside the window, but that's not what you're looking at. When you're studying an organism, say an ant, you don't necessarily, I mean, yes, you start with noticing that, the ant is figuring out where the sun is, and as a very strange computation, we can't do it as a function of time of day and time of year. But as you go beyond, you ask, well, what are the actual computations going on inside that? And if you could get far enough, you would set up experimental situations in which you wouldn't bother with the sun. You'd figure out what those internal computations are. You then find that they interact with all kinds of other things. They're not done in isolation. And out of that, you expect you're going to shed some light on what's going on when the occasion of sense that the insect is operating on happens to be connected to an external object, like the one 93 million miles away. But that's just kind of like a consequence of the investigation of the ant.
But if I could follow up on this question, I mean, this seems to be inconsistent with what you say in this reply to Ludlow here, where you're quoting Gallistel, right? So you say, Gallistel 1990 argues that the representations play a key role in animal behavior and cognition. Here, representation is understood as an isomorphism, a one-one relation between mind-brain processes and an aspect of the environment to which these processes adapt the animal's behavior.
It's not inconsistent. He's making an empirical claim, which is a very interesting one, and which is an introduction to a couple of volumes on animal representation. Right. And his conclusion, which I quote there, is that for animals, there is, in fact, a one-to-one relation, an isomorphism between an internal event and some property of the external world, like an odor. That's the example.
Right.
So the property of the external world was a particular odor, which is out there in the world, all right, but you could, if you knew how to do it, you could just use the sensory organs. And he says that's the way animal representation works, with this one-to-one correlation between things that are outside the animal, though you're really studying them at the sensory boundary, right. And the internal representations. Well, if that's correct, that's an interesting fact about animals, and they're very different from humans in that case.
So then maybe he's right about
it. It could be, yeah. It could be that they take the example I mentioned there, I think it's taken from him, right. That an ant some species of ants at least, will identify a corpse of a conspecific on the basis of a particular odor. Of course, if you give that odor and there's no conspecific around, they'll do exactly the same thing. Because according to this picture, he's saying, well, it's just triggered by the odor, which usually happens to come from a conspecific. But if you could control odors the way you can control lights, you could get the same behavior according to him if there's no conspecific.
Yeah, but just one more clarification question. It seems to me that no scientist can claim he has explained any kind of animal behavior if what we take to be its natural environment doesn't play an essential role in this explanation. And so I think if the relation between an ant and the sun, for example, it doesn't show up in this theory, then we haven't really explained what we wanted to explain.
Well, it depends what you want to explain. If you say the sciences, as the modern sciences have developed since Galileo, this is something of an innovation. They really are not trying to account for the phenomena of experience. I mean, indirectly, that's what motivates them. But what they're trying to do is discover the principles that enter into the way the world functions. And if you ask the guys in the physics department here, can you explain this videotape of what's going outside the window, they won't even bother answering. I mean, they can't say anything about that. It's way too complicated, way too many factors, and it's not even their topic. Their topic is to find out the principles of nature. So like when Galileo had a lot of problems with this. If you go back and look at the history, he had a lot of trouble convincing the funders, the rich aristocrats, who were the funders in those days, convincing them that it's worth studying something as ridiculous as a ball rolling down a frictionless plane. You know, because first of all, there's no such thing. You know, who cares anyway? You know, it was a conceptual breakthrough to get to the point where you began to understand that the phenomena of the world are of interest for the sciences insofar as they provide evidence for the principles of nature. And as soon as you proceed very far, you find out that the ordinary phenomena of nature is useless for this purpose, and you do what are called experiments, and sometimes thought experiments. Like you look back at Galileo, there's no reason to believe he ever dropped balls from the top of the Tower of Pisa. If you look at the argument, he gives a purely conceptual argument, convincing one, to show that that's what's going to happen. And it didn't matter whether you observed it or not. In fact, you don't observe it. But his argument was convincing because of the logic of it. And that's true of a lot of his experiments. If you read through them, you know, scholars have now determined he couldn't have carried out those experiments. There was no way for him to do it. Some of them he probably did, you know, some of them he was thinking about. But the point is, almost none of them had to do with observations of, you know, what you just a casual look at the world. The same with the theory of perception. So, for example, take an example of Descartes, which I'll adapt to this situation, but it's a Cartesian example. He says, if I look out there, what I see is a lot of people sitting in a room. Well, Descartes points out, you know, literally that's not what's hitting your eye. What's hitting your eye is, you know, something that's coming from that guy's head and that guy's foot, but there's nothing about people sitting in a room. Nevertheless, what you see is people sitting in a room. And then he says, well, how does this happen? And then comes the whole story about, on the occasion of sense, the cognoscitive powers make these complicated constructions, which include imposing the structure of people sitting in a room on these fragmentary sensations that are coming to me. But you don't, in perceptual psychology, as it proceeds, you don't study phenomena like people sitting in a room. That's just way too complicated.
But this isn't fair to the questioner, though, because he's not arguing against idealization. I mean, you could have a perfectly controlled experiment and still talk about,
That's right.
For example, in a simple, take an old sort of Skinner-type experiment with a pigeon pressing a bar. I mean, you can describe that behavior as the pigeon moving its claw or whatever, or you could describe it as bar pressing behavior, right?
That's
now, so I mean, this is not. It's not an issue about idealization.
No,
the questioner could easily say.
Yeah, but we're asking. He was well, at least I understood him to be asking something different.
Okay.
If the scientist cannot give an account of my seeing people in a room, they're not giving an explanation. That's far too strong. I mean, the scientists are giving explanations even if they can't get anywhere near describing real-life situations, and in fact, that's about all of modern science. The bar pressing is an interesting case because Skinner did impose on it the interpretation bar pressing, and that turns out to be wrong. It turns out with closer look that the pigeon pecking, which is what it was doing, actually incorporates different instinctive behaviors. The behavior of pecking for a seed and pecking for water turn out to be different instinctual behaviors, which happen to converge in this experiment. You just mislead yourself if you call it.
But isn't that Skinner's mistake? Is that he was an internalist, and if he'd been an externalist, then you would see that pressing for a seed and pressing for water are different behaviors.
It has nothing to do with externalism and internalism. I mean, the motivation for distinguishing seed from water comes from observing pigeons. But if you want to really carry it out further, you'll find out what's going on in the pigeon's head on the occasion of sense. And if you could carry out the programs far enough, you'd forget about the seed in the water, just like David Marr does. He doesn't talk about external things because he's trying to really discover what the principles are. So it's nothing to do with internalism and externalism. What it has to do with is giving the right idealization or the wrong idealization. Okay. And we're always doing that. I mean, every experiment involves, all kinds of interpretation as to what you're going to think about this thing and that thing. As the sciences get more refined, you try very hard to, not to cut it out, because you can't, but at least to be consciously aware of what you're putting in. Yeah. So you can sort of compensate for it if it's the wrong thing to put in.
Okay. Next question.
Hi. I think I have a much less sophisticated question than the previous one. But you have characterized eye language generally as an interface of sound and meaning. And at the same time, here you've also been very critical of the various senses of the term meaning and reference. So I just wanted to ask you if you could clarify, what do you mean by meaning?
Well, I mean, that's, again, like David Marr saying, I'm trying to figure out how you see an elephant. We start with the intuitive notions of sound and meaning, whatever they are. And, you go back to Aristotle, and he describes language as a pairing of something like sound and meaning, saying it in Greek. And yeah, that's where we start with. But as we proceed, we're going to have to refine both of these notions. So sound, as it's used here, doesn't have to do with what you and I call sound in ordinary talk, and meaning will be something very special. So like maybe it'll be, Davidsonian event semantics. Okay, maybe it'll be something built on that, and maybe sound will be something built on, my colleague Morris Halley's conception of instructions for articulatory gestures, or it'll be whatever it turns out to be as the sciences progress. And it'll end up having some loose relation to what we call sound and meaning, but no more so than energy or work or life or any of the other concepts that are dropped in the sciences, although they often keep the sounds when they talk about their new concepts. So that's to be answered, not to start with.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I guess that's it. Thanks a lot.
Okay,
appreciate it.